We're now live. Sound check. General Issues Committee meeting for Thursday, January 12th, 2022. Sound check. Good morning. We're going to go live for the sound check. We're now live. Sound check. General Issues Committee meeting for Thursday, January 12th, 2023. Sound check.
Good morning. Welcome to a special meeting of the General Issues Committee. The focus of our morning discussion is on EOC training. And it is January the 12th, 2023. It's my pleasure to be in the chair with you this morning. Quorum is present, and I would like to call this meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. As well, a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to the non-audible function. Members are reminded of the 5-minute time limit, which will be adhered to during this meeting. Clerk McCray, are there any changes to today's agenda?
No, Madam Chair, there are no changes to today's agenda.
Okay, it's moved by Councillor Taddison and seconded by Councillor Alex Wilson to approve the agenda as presented. Please vote accordingly.
Sorry, Councillor Francis, is that a thumbs up or do you have a question? Oh, thank you.
Take mine in the affirmative, please. That carries 13-0. Members, are there any declarations of interest this morning? Seeing none. Item 4 is private and confidential. May I please have a mover and a seconder to move into closed session pursuant to section 9.5 of the city's procedural bylaw 21021 as amended, and section 239 3.1 of the Ontario Municipal Act 2001 as amended as follows. A meeting of council or a committee may be closed to the public if A, it is held for the purpose of educating or training council members, and B, at the meeting, no member discusses or otherwise deals with any matter in a way that materially advances the business or decision-making of council or the committee. Did I mention that our coffee maker died at home and that's why I'm having a problem with my, okay. Is there any discussion respecting moving into closed session? Councillor Clark, please.
Morning, Chair. I was wondering if I could just get clarification from staff, perhaps the city manager, as to the rationale for holding the emergency training in closed session.
Thank you for that question. City Manager Smith, please.
Thank you. It was a long day yesterday. Thank you. Through the chair. When we put together a training session for members of council, because the Municipal Act, as the chair read, entitles council to go, we automatically put it that way, but we can definitely, I've spoken to staff, move into public and stay in public to do the training. There is some content that relates to around security related to emergency that we wouldn't be able to speak to in public. And so we'd have to go into camera for that content, both for the content itself and any questions, but the bulk of this could definitely be delivered in public. But we automatically, I spoke to the clerk about this because the Municipal Act allows it. That's how we list it on the agenda, but it's definitely council's prerogative on where they want to do the training. We will just advise you whether there's some components that we cannot do in public.
Thank you. Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate the city manager's comments. I think our staff are bright enough to ensure that any security issues that they might have just won't be made in public session. But I think there is, we should be educating the public as well as us, especially on the EOC, because from my experience in the last term when we had the EOC operational, there were a lot of questions from the community as to who they were, what they were, how come they could make these decisions. So I think it's important that we not only educate ourselves, but the broader community. So I would oppose the motion to go in camera on those grounds. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Clark, any other members wishing to speak to that which is before the body on the direction? And if you have an opinion on it or a contrary opinion as expressed by Councillor Clark? Councillor Clark, would you care to move a motion then? Is that necessary, Elsie McCray?
So through the chair, the motion to go in close wasn't moved and seconded. So if you wish to just do the training in open, I can note it in the minutes and you can do it in open.
Do I need to test the will of council on that opinion?
It can be a general consensus, or if committee would like a vote, I will need a mover and a seconder on going into closed.
So I will recognize Councillor Clark as the mover,
Yes, I would move that we go in open session.
and a seconder, Councillor Spatafora, please, that we remain in open for the purpose of this training session. If you could all vote for me. I have a thumbs up from Councillor Francis and myself. Oh, my beg your, no, not at all. Thank you very much. And as part of our commitment to capacity building, I neglected at the beginning to unpack what EOC means. It is the Emergency Operation Center, and that is what is going to be the focus of today's discussion. We've just, the pandemic, I think, underscored its importance and a need for all of us, including the public and members of council and staff, to fully understand the depth and breadth of its operations and its jurisdiction. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Chief Cunliffe, and he's going to begin the session for us. Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of council. It's certainly my pleasure to be here today, along with my colleagues in emergency management, to provide you with some training relative to our emergency management program that we have here in the city. The emergency management program is part of the services that are offered by the Hamilton Fire Department within the Healthy and Safe Communities. And we work collectively in terms of between our emergency management program and also our predominantly our fire prevention program, because there's many similarities. And as you're going to see through the presentation today, we will take advantage of the synergies that we have between the two in terms of a lot of public education, risk planning, in terms of also risk plan development. I'd like to take the opportunity now to formally introduce you to our two emergency management coordinators. First, Connie Verhage, and second is Kirsten Marples. I have to tell you, we're very, very fortunate here in the city to have these two folks as our coordinators. They are known throughout the province for their knowledge and expertise and content as a content expert. And there's many communities around that come to us and ask for advice and very much look at the program and the programs that we put together and we offer here in the city as leaders in the province. And many of them take our programs and adapt them for their communities. So I just want you to know how fortunate we are to have these two leaders in the field of emergency management working for the city and certainly working with me. So I'd like to turn it over to Connie to start the program.
Thank you very much, Chief Cunliffe, and thank you all for having us here today. It's an honor to present this information. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what is our obligation under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act and its regulations 38004. We're going to talk about some current trends in emergency management. We're going to talk about what's emergency management at the City of Hamilton and what is the role of mayor and councillor. And then we're going to have a scenario that the chief is going to present regarding an emergency response and what it looks like here at the city. We are mandated by the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. That is our mandate to provide an emergency management program here at the City of Hamilton. And that act has components or legislation that we must put in place within this municipality. And every municipality within Ontario must follow this regulation, and it's our job to do that. And I'm going to tell you, I've been involved in emergency management, and I'm going to date myself here, but since 1999, when we were doing Y2K planning. And I was asked on behalf of public health to go to this meeting to do some planning around, Y2K planning and emergency response. And at the time I thought, well, geez, what does emergency management or emergency response look like at the City of Hamilton? And this is a long, long time ago now. And at the time, all I was told is that, well, we have an emergency plan. And that was it. And over the years, I have seen that this act, which is in 2006, came into place and these regulations came into place. And it went from a plan that sits on a shelf to an emergency management program that has these components that must be put in place. So we're going to talk about these components and how they're in place at the City of Hamilton and what they mean. I'm not going to go into public education, annual training and exercise, because that is something that we do on a regular basis. But we're going to talk about other components of this legislation and how we at the City of Hamilton meet that mandate. Every municipality must have a city emergency manager called a CEMC. So you go to Halton, you go to Owen Sound, you go to Toronto, there will be a CEMC, and they are responsible for their emergency management program in their municipality. Here at the City of Hamilton, there's Kirsten, myself, and the chief as their alternate CEMC. Our role is to ensure that we're compliant to this Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act and its regulations. That's what our job is. And every year we develop a report that reports on all of those components and how we have met those regulations. That report is sent to Emergency Management Ontario. They review it. They look to see that we've met those compliance. And then they send a letter to the mayor to say, the City of Hamilton is compliant to these regulations and to the Act. And we have been compliant ever since I've been involved, ever since we've been doing this, we've been compliant. Every 5 to 7 years, the city must do a hazard identification risk analysis. And I've been involved in the development of this risk analysis since the early 2000s. We did one sometime in 2000, another one in 2011. We did a risk analysis again in 2017, and then we just finished one last year. This risk analysis, it is a process that takes quite a long time to develop and to complete. And what it involves, it's a process where we gather our stakeholders within the city. We take a look at the risks that are identified by the province, and we determine, okay, what are those potential risks here at the City of Hamilton? What does that look like here? What are the consequences of those risks? And we do what's called a risk analysis. We complete a hazard profile. And we did, last year, we did 25 hazard profiles here in the city. And we take a look and say, these are a risk. What are those consequences? What does it look like? And the methodology is developed by Emergency Management Ontario, and we must follow that methodology. And we complete the whole process. It takes anywhere from 6 months to a year to do. We did it last year in 6 months because we really needed to do another one. It had been 2017, there's a lot had changed. So the scoring is really based on this evaluation developed by Emergency Management Ontario. And this was the results of that. These are what we call our top 10 hazards or risk identified in the city of Hamilton. And I've been involved in this risk analysis, like I said, for quite a long time. And I see a couple of those risks that have changed. Last year or in 2017, I would say infectious disease was, I think it was our number 3 risk. So now it's moved up to number 1. In 2011, infectious disease was number 5. So these risks change as we do the analysis and go through the methodology. So some of these they've been there, they've just moved around. Some of them have moved off our list, like active shooter used to be number 10. That's moved off our list now because as we did the risk, we determined, okay, there's not a lot of consequences here. We haven't had this happen a lot here in the city of Hamilton, so it's moved off our list. What's new on this list is substance use and overdose. That one is new, that's big, that's something where we really were surprised to see it. But then again, not, because the consequences of substance abuse and overdose, it's death, mortality, it's illness, and those get rated at a higher consequence. So you get a higher number when you have that consequence. So Kirsten and I, we look at this list, we develop what's called our emergency exercise based on these are our risks, and this is what we need to be practicing on and develop our exercise on. Every municipality must have an emergency operations center, and it must have operable communication equipment in that operations center. So the city has identified a primary operations center, and it's state-of-the-art. And then as our second operations center, we use a virtual EOC. And that really occurred over pandemic because we were able to function in that operations center virtually. And then we have designated 3 what you call mobile sites. And those are locations that we could set up sort of on the fly. We can't meet at our primary. Something's happened where we can't get there. Virtual isn't going to work. So we have what's called mobile sites, and we have designated 3 of those ready to go. Every municipality must have an emergency plan, and they must have a bylaw. And we have our emergency plan reviewed annually by our Emergency Management Program Committee. So every year that program committee, we meet with them and we go through all of our compliance, all of our components to make sure that they are complete and that the program committee signs off on that. And the plan is very big. They must approve the plan, and it is by law. Last year, Kirsten and I looked at the plan, and we look at it every year. We look at it quite often. We determined that that plan needs to be changed because we have a new HIRA, and we had changed our IMS structure, and Kirsten will talk about that later. So the plan is it was changed. It was approved by our EMPC, or Emergency Management Program Committee, in December of last year. And so now that will go to council for approval, and that's going to be in February of this year. The plan will then be sent to the province, and it's stored there, and they will ask on that every year, is your plan updated, and do you have a bylaw? City of Hamilton has what's called an EOC management team. In the legislation, they refer to that EOC management team as the control group, and those are the people who are involved in the response. You've probably heard about the EOC management team over the pandemic for the last couple of years, but these are the people who get together when there is an emergency and they respond to help with that. And it consists of our mayor, the members of the senior leadership team, our fire chief, paramedic chief, police chief, legal, and our medical officer of health. Those are the people that get activated when there's an emergency, and they help to support the response. Well, it's the world is changing. We've seen it. I've been involved in this profession for a very, very long time, and I've seen it change. And even over the Christmas holidays, when we saw, a couple of, we got notified by the province regarding the storm and asked for some support. I mean, on Christmas Day, we were attending a meeting regarding that, and it was hosted by the province, and we were attending it. And that's something I've never seen happen before, ever. But our world is changing. There are changes to it. One of the big drivers of that, and it's no surprise, is climate change. It's weather related, and we see some impacts. We've got longer and hotter summers, increase in the amount of what you call heat exposures, heat alerts, forest fires, and droughts. We have an increase in that freezing and melting cycle, so more ice storms. Pretty lucky so far. We do expect it, usually February, March, April, that's our big time for that. Getting more precipitation in the winter and in the spring and less in the summer. So you get those drier, hotter summers. We've got this increase in rain intensity and in flooding, an increase in extreme what you call weather events, shorter periods between times. And we saw that in what's called that 100-year flood or 100-year event. That's out the window now. We're getting them. Intensity is greater and they're more frequent. Other trends that we've noticed, and this is no surprise either, is increase in intentional acts of violence. We're seeing an increase in cyber attacks. 2017, I think 2016, we did an exercise on cyber attacks. What would happen if we had a ransom attack where we were given, where our systems were out? What does that look like? And we had risk management there, we had our IT team there. It was really interesting to look at what does that impact? What does that mean for city services? And how are we going to deliver city services if we're attacked? And those are some of those what you call emergency exercise, where we walk through consequences and how we're going to mitigate. We have an increase in the availability of chemicals and radioactive and hazardous material. No surprise there. And so you're seeing this increase in explosions, especially house explosions and structure fires. So how does emergency response work at the city? What does that look like? We have a phenomenal tactical response team. That's our fire, our paramedics, our police. They respond to the site. They will determine, we need support, we need assistance. They will make a call to the chief will call us, we will notify the EOC management team. And that's how we get activated. And our role is a strategic support. What do we need to support the tactical? What is required at site for this response? Do we need buses? Do we need evacuation centers? Do we need personnel to respond? What's required? And that's what that strategic, that EOC team will do. We're not tactical, we're strategic. And then we ask policy group or Council of Mayor for policy support. And this is in the way of, do we need a bylaw to respond? We saw that during the pandemic. We needed a physical distancing bylaw. We needed a mask bylaw to respond. But there's other bylaws that could come in place. In the Fort McMurray fires, they needed a bylaw that would allow them to store their home trailer, mobile trailer, on their site. Because prior to the fires, that wasn't allowed. You're not allowed to have your trailer for residents on site. But during the fires and post-fire, they realized these people need to get back to the community. They need to get back into their home, and their home may not be inhabitable. So they allowed, through a bylaw, through council, to have their mobile home on site so that they can be in their community. And that's the example of what that policy or council will do to support an emergency. So emergency response starts at the tactical, it moves to the strategic, which is the EOC, and then it moves into policy, which is council and mayor. And this is my favorite slide, Kirsten. I know you're going to laugh because I always ask for it to be in. And the reason I like this slide, this is an example of a home. This was an example of a home that was destroyed down in Tornado Alley. Tornado came through, destroyed the home. But there was a boy at home when the warnings came through. And he knew his emergency response. There was public education and awareness, and he knew that if there's a tornado, you need to go to a safe place. And a safe place is a place where there are no windows. So in the bathroom he went, tornado comes through, and he was safe. And that is what you call your emergency education and your emergency public education at work. He was educated, he was aware, he knew what to do, and he was safe. The home was destroyed, but he was safe. So when do we activate? When the site needs support. So the fire chief, police chiefs will call and say, we need help down here. We need to activate. There's a large-scale, complex response, so they need support. That's when we will activate. There's a significant population at risk. So you've got an infectious disease that's just zoning in on a certain population, or young kids or elderly, they will need support. When we're uncertain, or there's a risk, or there's an information management component that needs to be handled at a higher level. There's a major planned event. During World Cycling in 2003, we activated. We set up an emergency operations center at the Hydro building on John Street, and we were all there while those cyclists were on the road. We were ready to respond. During Pan Am, we were all on standby. EOC was ready to go, and all of us were available. So we have a major planned event, lots of people attending. We will be on standby or we'll activate. We've got a threat, a potential threat that we're monitoring. During the Hurricane Sandy that came along our eastern seaboard and potential impact into Hamilton, we had a couple of people in the EOC, and it wasn't hitting until midnight, but we had people who came in around 7 o'clock at night and stayed till about 1, 2 o'clock just to be ready. So those are all events or reasons why we would activate. And how do we activate? First responders at site, they will notify us. And we have an automated system that we will activate to say, there's an emergency, please respond to the EOC. And it's all automated. It's actually very brilliant. It's really, I've seen quite a change over the years. We used to do manual call and we would call everybody, and now we have got this automated system. And all of the EOC management team has on their phone or listed as their contact that number. So that if that number comes up, it will say EOC, it will say emergency, and they will know to respond to that. So that's some of the changes that I've seen over the years. I'm now going to turn it over to Kirsten, who's going to conclude the rest of this presentation.
Thank you very much, Connie, and good morning, everyone. Through the chair, as the chief mentioned, Kirsten Marples, Emergency Management Coordinator, work alongside Connie. So just continuing a little bit about what Connie was speaking to, the main responsibilities of the EOC management team. As she said, it's very distinctive in the fact that we do not get involved in the tactical response. That is done by the boots on the ground. We have faith in their ability to do that. We're really providing that strategic direction. Site support, so do we need people? Do we need tools? Do we need resources? Those are the sorts of things that we would provide to the site. And we collect information about the emergency. So that happens through our planning section, which you'll see in a bit, that they collect that information, they evaluate it, and then they determine if it needs to be distributed. Another major role of the EOC is coordinating agencies or departments. So that could be coordinating support from various NGOs, Red Cross, Good Shepherd, et cetera. It could be liaising with the province for requests for supports, or depending on the nature of the emergency. So think in terms of if we had an incident at our airport, we could need to be in contact with the senior leadership or emergency staff at that location. We do a lot of resource management, so we're gathering resources through our logistics section, and we're keeping track of where those resources have been deployed and when they're returned. And I'd say perhaps most critically, we're managing internal and external communication. We saw that to the nth degree, I think, in the COVID-19 response, that through our emergency information officer, we were ensuring that appropriate information made its way out to the community, but also internally to our staff as well. How are decisions made? So there aren't easy decisions that are made in the EOC. These are challenging decisions. These are things that are happening often quite quickly. So we actually have this set of standard response goals. They are posted within our EOC and within our EOC boardroom, and they're numbered for a reason, because they are numbered by priority. So it shows that when we get in that EOC boardroom sometimes and we're making decisions about strategies that we're going to use to respond to this emergency, we sometimes have to make tough decisions. Our first response goal is always to protect the safety and health of our responders. And that is because they play a role in the priorities thereafter. So you see save lives, reduce suffering, et cetera. The last on that list is reduce economic and social losses. So when we are making some of those tough decisions, we will look at these response goals. They are response goals used by other municipalities and organizations. They are standard. So here we have the City of Hamilton's EOC organizational structure. Don't be frightened by it. I'll walk through it with you. This has a very distinct color setting to it and arrangement, and there is a reason for that. We operate under the IMS, or Incident Management System model. Some of you may be familiar with it. It is used, I'd say, by the majority of municipalities in this province and perhaps across the country. It is used by the Provincial Emergency Operations Center, as well as several of the agencies and organizations that would respond in an emergency with us: hospitals, Port Authority, airport. And it's a common organizational structure actually built on military principles. And it's based on the fact that for every incident, regardless of its size or magnitude, there are certain management functions that always have to happen. So above that line on about a third of the way down the screen there, you'll see some red and green coloring there. That's our command structure. So that's referred to as command. You'll see our EOC director sits there, our city manager is there as well, and then the communications loop through to the mayor and the policy group. Below that, we have 4 section chiefs, and the colors mean something. So the orange is our operations section, blue is our planning chief, yellow is logistics, and then finally gray being finance. And you'll see a lot of support under the operations section. We have representation from all 3 of our first responder agencies there, and we have departmental representation or branch. And I'll draw your attention to the last one there, which is key stakeholder. So in the case of an emergency, dependent on the type of the emergency, we have the ability to bring in a guest into our EOC. So if we did an exercise a couple of years ago regarding an exercise down at the marina, a Port Authority. So we had someone from the Port Authority come and sit in that chair. They can share information with us. We can share information back to them. So it's a very distinct function that we rely on. So here there are about 21 positions that would report to the EOC. You'll see on the next chart as I move forward, the organization chart becomes a bit larger. So this is our level 2 response. You're starting to see that we're building out that planning section, we're building out that logistics section a little bit more, as well as finance. So I want to go back to just mention briefly why we use the IMS model. So not only those management functions, but because these other organizations, police, otherwise, use this similar structure, there's that common terminology, common procedures that allows interoperability during an emergency. The other thing we really like about the IMS model is it adopts a toolbox approach. So we can come in, there may be at the start of an emergency, have all these 40 positions reporting into the EOC. As the emergency evolves, we can pull away positions or add positions as need be. In fact, during the COVID-19 pandemic, our IMS structure evolved almost a dozen times. So at different points, whether we were in recovery or whatever the case may be, we adjusted it as need be. So that is the structure, that we use within the EOC. Going to talk a little bit about the role of the mayor in the EOC or in a response. So obviously they're receiving updates, particularly from the city manager, perhaps with direction from our EOC director or information from our EOC director pertaining the emergency itself. They have a role to keep council updated in the information as it evolves. They are certainly seen as the spokesperson. So if you look at large events that have happened in other neighboring municipalities, you'll often see the mayor. That is who citizens most often expect to see when something like that is happening. So they participate in media briefings. They participate in press conferences. We saw that through the course of the pandemic as well. The citizenry does really look at them for direction. They liaise with other mayors and the province. So if I give an example of an extreme weather event. Very rarely does that extreme weather event end right at our borders, right? So you're going to see impacts in other neighboring communities. There may be a need to share information with other mayors. There may be a need to request support from other mayors as well, and also with the province. One very important role, which I noticed we neglected to put on this slide here, is it is the mayor that has the authority to declare a state of emergency within the city. They often do so with consultation with our city manager and our EOC director, but it is the mayor that actually does need to sign off on that and submit it to the province. They then conversely also have the authority to terminate that emergency declaration. Role of council, so quite clearly receiving obviously those updates from the mayor. Connie talked about the need, that policy kind of role, so the need to approve bylaws in response. I believe it was late summer in 2020 when the physical distancing bylaw came in. That was a discussion had at the EOC table. It said, you know what, we really need something in place, and so we bring that to council for approval. But that's just a small example of the type of policies or bylaws that might be needed to support a response. And obviously keeping constituents informed. This is very key. Constituents will come to you and ask for information about the emergency. The information officer, the communications team in the EOC will help to collate information and facts about the emergency. We may need you to assist us with giving information to the public on what to do in the case of an emergency. So that's a very key role that you would play in an emergency. Recovery, I will say, is the longest phase of the emergency management response or program, right? So you've got the response itself. You think of a tornado perhaps comes through an area of town. You've got that immediate response. You've got people going out doing search and rescue, that kind of thing. And then we move into recovery. And that can go for 3 hours, 3 days, 3 months. It can even go into years, depending on the impact of such an emergency. So we list here just a few things that we might be dealing with, but just to, I think, to highlight that the response isn't just about at the time the emergency occurs. It really can continue on. Damage assessments are a big one. So there was those tornadoes that went through in the Barrie area and the destruction that happened there in a very populated residential area. So we have our friends in the building department who would assist us with looking at structural integrity of buildings, infrastructure, that kind of thing. Debris removal. So some of you were here for the ice storm in 2013, and we look at the debris. So we had hydro lines coming down, we had tree branches coming down, and a shout out to our Public Works Department to help us and partner with us to do a lot of that debris removal as well. So that can become a huge component. We have a very generous citizenry in here in the city of Hamilton, and oftentimes in the case of emergency, and even not even large emergencies, they want to help. So they're giving funds, they're making donations, whether it be clothing, whether it be furniture, that kind of thing. And we need to manage that because it can become a lot. I was thinking about, we had a fire down at Stony Brook Homes in Lower Stony Creek a couple of years. It was actually during the pandemic. And immediately we started to receive donations. So we need to manage that. We need to think about what are the needs of the residents and how do we match that up with what we have and go out and solicit perhaps the items that these folks are going to need. We can be looking at other things, housing relocation, transportation, and then of course, volunteer management as well. So these are only a few of the recovery issues, but understand that that's often the largest period of time that we're dealing with. I want to talk a little bit about emergency and social services. So we do have an obligation as a municipality under the EMPCA to provide what are called necessary services in the event of a large-scale emergency. They're often called basic human needs, and we call them in the realm of emergency management, ESS, or emergency social service. They're divided into 5 categories. So we have emergency shelter or lodging, we have food provision, clothing, personal services, which could include personal hygiene or perhaps mental health supports and other such things. and then registration and inquiry. So these are the things that we have a responsibility in that immediate term, short term after an emergency, to make sure that our citizenry has access to those things. And how do we do that, you may ask? So we have a group called the Emergency Social Service Control Group. It is headed by Bonnie Elder, our director there. She's, of course, as you would know, a director of Ontario Works. And she has a structure here as well. You'll see the coloring is very similar to our EOC management team. So this is our ESS control group. So she would call out to her various supports. You'll see she has an information officer, and then she also has the 4 planning chiefs. And they would start to mobilize to help coordinate the citizenry receiving what supports they need. But they don't do this alone. They do it with community partners. They do it with city departments. I'll say that we do rely heavily on our NGOs. We have an agreement with Red Cross to provide support for us. Salvation Army often helps out, as well as Good Shepherd and St. John's Ambulance. So they may be reaching out to those folks to provide various types of support, whether in the shape of food or clothing, donations, and even shelter. We do not just reach out to these people at the time of emergency. We have ongoing relationships with them. We plan with them. We do training. We do exercises with them. Red Cross, as you probably know, are experts in this type of thing, so we do certainly work with them very often. And then a shout out to some of our city departments that help support us in these types of responses. When we have structure fires or other types of emergencies and families are displaced, often people have pets, and pets are part of people's family. So we encourage residents to have an emergency plan that includes a place for your pets. But if you don't, our friends at Animal Services will step in and help us with that as well. So we're very grateful for that. Public health services, so we look at whether it be food provision at a congregate site where maybe we're providing support. They would ensure food safety. In COVID, it became a big deal when it came to infection prevention and control, that they would help provide us with expertise and support for that as well. And I want to give a special shout out to HSR, who not only help us in larger scale emergencies by providing shelter on buses, but even in other structure fires that you see throughout the year. Oftentimes, if a building needs to be evacuated due to a fire in a unit, we will call transit. They will provide buses that people can shelter on, whether to stay warm or to stay cool, depending on the season, and give some comfort to those folks before they can return to their building. So they do a phenomenal job in supporting the work that we do. We do have pre-designated evacuation centers here in the city, and you'll be familiar with them because they are our recreation and community centers. We're very fortunate to have a very geographically spread out list of these centers. We have done site visits at these locations. In fact, we do them quite often, and we have maps within an emergency kit at those sites that designate this is where lodging would happen. If we had to do congregate lodging, it would happen typically in the gymnasium. Here's where food provision would happen. Here's where clothing donation would happen. Here's where we provide counseling services. And we run through drills to make sure that these centers are ready to go and that the staff that support them are ready to go. So we work with the logistics chief in our emergency social service control group to make sure that they are ready to go. I'll say also too, Red Cross is a big support here. So when we open an evacuation center, often that first call will be to Red Cross to say we're going to set up at one or more of these sites. And we will do so, and they will come and help provide supports there as well. So it's with great pleasure I'm going to invite the chief back to the microphone here, who's going to walk you through a little bit of an emergency scenario. Chief?
So we thought that maybe it would be helpful if we took a bit of a scenario and provide you that information so you can see now how the components that you've heard about this morning come together and some of the decision-making process. So the scenario that we're going to give you is then this will be for our friends in Public Works. And again, this is a scenario that we've actually run through here in the city a couple of years ago. So we've got a contractor who's working at the water treatment plant and drives a large construction vehicle between a large volume chlorine gas rail car and the chlorine building that's on site. The top of the vehicle hits the chlorine feed pipes, which are between the rail car and the building, and breaks the chlorine supply lines, causing a leak and a release. The driver is unconscious and is pinned in the vehicle, and then there's a smell of chlorine gas, and there's also now a gas cloud that has been formed. This is a realistic scenario, folks. This is not something that's, out of far-fetched and out of the ordinary. This absolutely can and potentially could happen. So right away, the workers notify 911. The appropriate first responders are dispatched. And in this case, the Hamilton Fire Department would be taking the lead on this event because it is a hazardous materials incident. We're very fortunate. Our fire department provides a hazardous materials response at the highest level, technician level, which is consistent across the province with the larger fire departments. So we get there, we do a size up of what's going on, and we confirm that we have a large amount of gas that is involved, and that we now are looking to get the quantities that are involved so that we can basically do an impact analysis. So quickly, based on what we've received, we now have calculated, and the folks on scene, the hazardous materials technicians that we have, will be determining, based on a number of different protocols, that all of a sudden we need to have an evacuation radius of 2 kilometers of this facility. And we also have to have a 4-kilometer buffer zone. So what we would be looking at is immediate zone, and then we have that has to be evacuated, and then we have another zone which would be an additional 2 kilometers that would be on standby in terms of depending on the direction that the plume would potentially move. Our folks on scene have the ability to develop modeling in terms of where this plume potentially will go based on wind direction, as well as temperature. And so we'd be pulling all that information together. Based on this type of incident and the potential impact, I would be notifying Connie and Kirsten of the requirement to activate the Emergency Operations Center. Because of the impact, not only in terms of to mitigate this event at the water treatment plant, but also the impact to our residents, and then the potential future impact on ability of the city to continue to deliver service. And I'll just get into that in a second. So during this, we would be looking at what our options are to mitigate the actual incident, but then we'd be looking from a recovery perspective. We'd want to be asking questions in terms of, how extensive is the damage to the mechanics of the plant? How long is it going to take to get things repaired? And then the other piece is how long can we maintain service delivery, in this case, providing clean drinking water if the plant is inoperable for a period of time. So based on those questions, we find out that it's going to take a period of time, potentially up to a week, to repair what's been damaged. And as of this point, we've been notified we have 3 days of drinking water supply. So as you can imagine now, in the Emergency Operations Center, we would now be looking to look at evacuation pieces. So we would be activating the Emergency Social Services Control Group. We would need to identify where the evacuation zones are. We would be working collectively with Hamilton Police Service to set up the perimeters, as well as assisting with evacuation. We would be then working with our communications branch within the Emergency Operations Center to get information out through all forms of media to be able to get to the public, to let them know of those that are in the impacted area, those that are in the areas that need to shelter in place and be prepared. We'd also be involving our Public Works group within the operations team, basically going through all the scenarios in terms of the different impacts, and we would be developing a strategic plan based on that the operations chief would be bringing forth when we go through a management cycle within the Emergency Operations Center. So what would happen is the Emergency Operations Center director would be calling a meeting of the various chiefs. So it would be the operations chief, the planning chief, logistics chief, and the finance chief. We would be meeting, we'd be bringing updates to that meeting. We would be talking about the requirement for additional resources, any policy decisions that we would have to look at getting made. We would be looking at whether or not we have the resource base within the municipality to deal with it, or are we going to have to declare an emergency based on the circumstances and ask for provincial help or provincial resource or resource from another municipality to help us to deal with this. And obviously, the other big thing is how do we sustain the ability to deliver clean water to the residents over that period of time? And that would be done in a very short period of time. Typically, when we get into the EOC, within the first half hour, there's a debrief from the various groups, predominantly operations, that would provide an overview, and then within another 30 to 45 minutes, we would have the operational group, control group meeting, and we would be off in making decisions. And then it's done on a regular cycle. So then the EOC director would then develop a business cycle that we would be coming back, providing updates in terms of what's been resolved, what's happening, and if there's other challenges or things that are coming up that we would be dealing. And this would be ongoing, and it would continue until we through the different phases. So the first phase obviously is the mitigation stage. So trying to stop or put a hold on the event that's happening from the immediate emergency. And then it would be then turning our focus to the recovery phase and what that looks like, and getting the resources and the plans in place to do that, as well as then providing those updates through to the mayor, and who would obviously provide it to council, and then also disseminating some of that information out to the public so that they're aware of what's going on. The biggest thing here is to ensure that the public understands that the city has this well under control, that we have got the necessary resources we need, and that we're doing it in as timely a manner as we can. Because that's what our role is, and that's what the expectation is of our residents. So we want to make sure they understand that we're fulfilling that expectation. This then would go on, as you heard Connie say, it could go on for weeks or months or whatever that period of time is until we can get resolved. So in a nutshell, that's how things would happen behind the scenes in the EOC, and the types of decisions that are made, and how virtually the community comes together to deal with an emergency. So with that, we would be happy to entertain any questions or comments from members of council.
Thank you, Chief Cunliffe. And on behalf of committee, thank you to Senior Coordinator Verhaeg and Coordinator Marples for your very informative and important presentation this morning. There are 4 members of council who are on the docket with questions. Councillor Alex Wilson, Councillor Clark, Councillor Danko, and Councillor Jackson. I recognize Councillor Alex Wilson.
Thank you. And through the chair, thank you so much for the presentation. This is actually my second time receiving it from both of you. In fact, I got it as a citizen member of the ACPD committee a couple of years ago, and a lot of the conversation then focused around evacuations and kind of in these emergency events or in these acute emergencies, if we're at, I'll talk into my microphone, if we're at a point where we're evacuating folks, how are residents, either communication needs, physical disabilities, their ability to kind of evacuate, how is that kind of handled? And then I have some further questions, but just so we all in this room have that understanding, because I found that really, really helpful when it was presented a couple of years ago.
Question is in relation to handling emergencies for people with disabilities. Right, yeah. So that's one of the areas that we have done some work with. We did quite a bit of work with people in with hearing, the Hearing Society, and walking through that as far as, okay, this is what response will look like. This is what you need to have in place. And these are your sort of your toolkit that you need to have ready. Absolutely. We have, when we set up our evacuation centers, we did take a look at that to make sure that this does make it friendly for those who have disabilities, and that if they're in a wheelchair, that they'd be able to get into that evacuation center. You know, Alex, one of the things that is really important is that preparedness starts with the person. And that's what we spend during Emergency Preparedness Week, is that we really work on notifying and getting public awareness out to people so that they have preparedness and they're ready to respond. And so we ask that people get prepared by having a kit, by having a plan. That's really important for these people. They need to have a plan. Who's their point of contact? Who will be checking in on them? What is it that they're going to take? So we ask that that happens there, and that will really help in the response, so that if fire is coming to that building, they will know, you know, the management of that building will have a list of those who need assistance with evacuation. They will help as far as, you know, getting that list to fire. That will help us as far as the evacuation goes. So preparedness starts there, and then we try to do the best that we can to meet those needs.
Thank you so much for that. And I really heard and agree that we all have a role to play, whether we're a building manager, and that's involved being prepared as individuals. And so in the spirit of kind of supporting folks in that preparedness, I know with the climate emergency coming, and today had to put out some information regarding the flooding event that's potentially occurring today. And so lots of folks that's on their mind as we think about the climate emergency, specifically in Ward 13, where folks are kind of at the lower end of a stream and right there where flooding has happened. And some of the conversations we had during the election, what I heard from folks is they want to participate. They want to find a way, not in necessarily these acute emergencies that we've been talking about here, but in more of the low level, kind of being prepared and being proactive, knowing who their neighbors are on their street, how can they be helpful. I know Councillor Nan last term of council ran a pod mapping exercise to try and connect neighbors.
Nice.
If we have interest and engaged people in our communities who want to think about how to be more prepared or get more engaged, are there resources that they can plug in with? I understand the focus of this training is more around those acute emergencies, but in the spirit of preparedness, how can we connect communities who want to be more prepared and community members?
Such a good question. Such a very good question. And we did at one time, and Chief Cunliffe, if you remember this, we did have what's called a group of community emergency volunteers. There was quite a few of them, actually. It was over 300 people that we had gathered and were doing, you know, some work as far as how to be a community volunteer. That has gone out the window. It just became too big to manage. We decided that, you know, over the years, because it was really about 2006 that came into place, and then over the years it fell apart just because we couldn't keep a handle on the volunteers and what their role would be and whatnot. You almost need a whole other team just to manage volunteers, and just to keep them educated, keep them involved, get them to check on neighbors. That's a big portfolio, something that I would love to see happen. We don't have the resources here. And so that's why we moved to more of our public education campaign, that people work together and educate and to help each other during emergencies. We do have those community hubs, and we've done presentations at those hubs. I remember going to Beasley and Sherman. There's a couple of those hubs and doing presentations at that site. So we have done that type of work. It hasn't happened since COVID, obviously, but that is something that we could certainly bring forward, you know, kind of work on. Yeah.
Sorry, if I can just add to that through the chair. So I wanted to give a plug to, we do have a very developed emergency preparedness guide at the City of Hamilton. And for folks that are interested in preparedness outside of our ability to be able to speak to every citizen, which I think is what we would like to do. So that is available in hard copy, or it is available in a printable version on our city website. It's extensive. It provides all sorts of information on how you can prepare yourself, things that you can inventory within your house and for insurance purposes around flooding. So I would really recommend people who are interested go to that. But further to Connie's point there, I mean, we have gone out to several community groups. We do go out to City Housing Hamilton. We've done some of their meetings as well. As much as we can push out that message about personal preparedness, we're happy to do it. So.
Thank you so much. Those were all my questions, and I really appreciate the answer about like the capacity right now. And if we want to have conversations moving from individual preparedness to levels of kind of community preparedness, that involves more resources. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions. When a state of emergency is declared and the EOC, recognizing that the EOC can be operational without that state of emergency, but given this scenario, does our city staff have any additional authority or powers based on the declaration of a state of emergency or the launching of the EOC?
I'd like to take that question. Chief?
So through the chair to the councillor, the declaration of a state of emergency predominantly is the ability to tap into additional resources through the province or other municipalities that the province may be able to direct us to. Relative to staff having additional powers, I guess you will, or decision making, what it does is it provides direction, or the EOC through the EOC director will provide what they believe is the appropriate direction that we need to take. And it would be, I would suggest to you that under the emergency piece, as we saw through the pandemic, there were authorities that were provided to the city manager or the director to be able to make decisions. But that formally, and I'll let the city manager also jump in.
City Manager, please.
Through the chair to council. So excuse me, under the procurement bylaw, we do have the authority to expedite the purchase of things we need. During the pandemic, it was personal protective equipment, et cetera. Mike can give you more details on how that process is. We always report back to council on when we've used that. So we do have provisions under the procurement. You know, typically emergencies are quick and don't last. With the pandemic, because of the uncertainty with it, and we were at a point when we didn't know when we could have in-person council meetings, because under the provincial legislation, we couldn't do virtual council meetings. And we didn't know if the province was going to change that or whatever. So when we had that last in-person council meeting spread out all over, and I wasn't even here because I was on lockdown because of being a COVID exposure, we brought a delegated authority bylaw forward that gave me authorities beyond what I traditionally have, and with the agreement that I would report back to council on how it was used. And that was extremely helpful because that enabled us, when provincial and federal money started flowing to us, that we quickly had to accept and get out the door to, you know, to food providing organizations, to the shelter providing organizations. I had all the authority to, you know, bring it in and get it out the door with, you know, checks and balances and agreements in place. And then I reported back to council on a regular basis on how that was used. Now, once we got back into virtual council meetings, I wasn't using that anymore. And once it's been now withdrawn, so I don't have that delegated authority. So those would be the things off the top of my head. The one thing that happened during the pandemic that was different than what I've seen in previous emergencies is the province passed some legislation that gave us authority to redeploy staff. You know, regardless of collective agreements and things like that, so that whether it was hospitals or municipalities could redeploy staff. They checked in regularly with all of our CAOs just to make sure they weren't keeping that in place longer, because in terms of good labor relations. And first and foremost, our labor leaders were amazing, sitting down and working through issues with us, whether it was transit or other things, but they did give that extra authority.
Thank you for that response, Chair. And I only ask because during the pandemic, residents were clearly confused that there was council and there was an EOC, and they weren't really like, who's running the ship? And having that clarity is important. Can I ask through you, Mayor, to, I believe it would be the chief, are the hospitals involved in our emergency operations center?
So through the chair to the councillor, yes. And in fact, on a regular basis, the coordinators from the hospital who look after the emergency planning are in consultation with our coordinators. We do joint exercises, and depending on the type of emergency, they would be, as Connie alluded to, within our structure, one of those guests that we would be bringing in so that they would sit right at the operations table.
And the reason I asked that question is on the list where you talked about the shelter spaces that would be available for an emergency, all the different community centers. I didn't see any of the hospitals, and I know the hospitals operate a Code Orange system. So if they have a crisis in their hospital or in the community, they can open up their space, and they do have auditoriums and things like that. I think of St. Peter's Hospital has a large auditorium. So I was just curious whether or not, because if I look at all the systems, if it's a citywide incident, we don't have enough space.
So through the chair to the council, I can give you an example. So when we had the fire at St. Peter's a number of years ago, and we had to evacuate the wing, we actually had Health and Health Sciences at the table with us as we were looking at our evacuation strategy, and we were utilizing them in terms of identifying rooms that they would be able to, or places that they could give us within the hospital where we could actually evacuate some of the residents to, along with our long-term care facilities.
Thank you. I have two more questions. Let me know when I run out of time, Chair. This question is on page 7 of your report. It had a list of hazard identification and risk assessment. It included substance use and overdose. And I'm trying to understand what would the thresholds be for us to declare an emergency for overdose. We've seen an unprecedented number of overdoses in the city, and sadly, an unprecedented number of overdose deaths. And so I'm trying to understand what is the thresholds that we would use in order for the city to call, in essence, a state of emergency due to overdoses?
Through the chair to the councillor, very good question. And you know, it would be at a time when we are overwhelmed in response to this event. So we have a large number of overdoses. Our hospitals are overwhelmed. Public health is overwhelmed. Our social services are overwhelmed. We don't have a threshold number. That was never, determined by the province. It's just that if we are overwhelmed, then we would look at opening up our operations center and looking at how do we handle this.
If I understand provincial legislation, if we declare a state of emergency, it opens up some funding opportunities. So when I'm looking at this issue with regards to substance abuse, we're hitting some really high numbers. And I'm wondering if the declaration of a state of emergency over substance abuse and overdoses specifically, whether or not it would open up the funding for us to help more people, because it's not just the downtown Hamilton issue, it's citywide, and ODs are happening everywhere.
If I could just piggyback on that, the prerogative of the chair, if you could clarify Councillor Clark's line of questioning in terms of what threshold kicks in this emergency. The last council declared a opioid emergency, deemed it to be a priority because of our extensive above average deaths according. And I'm wondering, what is the relationship between that and the line of questioning, good line of questioning that Councillor Clark is pursuing here? Through my apologies for.
No, that's very helpful, Chair. Thank you.
And through the chair to the councillor, I would have to go back and take a look at that declaration and when that happened and whatnot, or maybe our general manager has.
I believe it was November of 2019, but you can check. And GM Burden, you wanted to?
Thank you. Angie Burden, General Manager of Healthy and Safe Communities. Through you, Madam Chair, I would recommend that we bring a report back and that we connect in with Public Health and Dr. Richardson to inform the conversation so that we have the proper information for Council. I'm happy to do that.
Chair, at the appropriate time, we'd be happy to move that motion because I really think we need to dig a little bit deeper on it. I mean, you've educated me on a number of things and you reminded me about funding opportunities. And if this is, and I would deem it a crisis, but I don't know what my colleagues or public health would say. The last one, and it'd be very quick. Does the fire department have a clear record of where hazardous materials are being stored? And is it a requirement of anyone warehousing hazardous materials to give that information to the fire department? And that's my last question. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief Cunliffe.
So through the chair to the councillor, we do not have a record of all places where hazardous materials are stored. Hazardous materials are widely used in various different classifications. The larger components that we typically are made aware of, we have those records, and we maintain that in our databases relative to properties. But there's a number of even in residential homes, people have what would be deemed hazardous materials and some folks are stockpiling those things based on products availability. So the absolute answer to your question is no, we don't have that knowledge of all of the material all through the city.
Thank you. Councillor Danko is with us virtually, so he would be just behind you on the screen.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? Because we were having some problems earlier. Okay, excellent. I remember receiving this training back in 2018 or 2019, the beginning of the term. At that time, it was hypothetical. All of a sudden, it wasn't hypothetical anymore. So I really appreciate this. And I think, you know, personally anyway, take it much more seriously now that we've seen the EOC in action and a response to an extremely severe emergency in our city. Going through the presentation, some of the evolving threats evaluation of things that could happen in Hamilton that we're preparing for. One of the ones that I'm personally very concerned about is the growing authoritarian fascist movements throughout Canada, and also, you know, very established fascist movements in the United States, and that's spreading here. And we've seen that in Hamilton with the Yellow Vesters, and then that you know, white nationalists, and it spread to the so-called Freedom Convoy, which led to, you know, occupations in Ottawa and border crossings and so on. So is that specifically something that we are planning for, and how are we, you know, tracking or evaluating, you know, kind of those threat levels from those neo-fascist groups?
Thank you, Chief Cunliffe.
So through the chair to the councillor, that question would be better answered by the police chief. His organization would be directly involved in performing some of the things that you have asked about.
Okay. Yeah, I did have a couple follow-up questions on, you know, what or how we would prepare for occupations, or, you know, something in Hamilton's, for example, shutting down the port by occupying the lift bridge. But I think that would probably be similarly something that would be better asked for, you know, the police chief, or perhaps discussed in private session. So I'll just leave that with you. I don't know if you have a response, Chief.
So through the chair to the councillor, my answer to you would be this, is that relative to the disruption, the components of disruption that might have relative to the city's ability to deliver service, That's the EOC would then deal with those components, and that would be dealt with as we would deal with it if that for a disruption that would be caused by many potential things. So if it was a traffic issue, then we would be looking to deal with that in terms of how we reroute or whatever we need to do. If it has something to do with disruption of infrastructure or the ability to deliver service, again, we would then get together and develop a contingency plan to be able to initiate or continue that service.
Thank you. I just have one final question, Chair, and it's related to the Freedom Convoy protest, but I think it's kind of a general question in terms of our emergency response. So in the Ottawa protests, it was quite well known, and it's been revealed through the evaluation of that a lot of the information of the emergency response planning was actually shared with the occupiers through the services that were involved, with sympathizers or members that were, part of the actual Freedom Convoy occupation. So from when we are into an emergency response, how do we, control the information that's available and our response? Like what processes are in place to make sure that, we're not sharing with people that shouldn't have that information?
Thank you. Chief.
So through the chair to the councillor, so at the EOC level, in terms of the EOC management team, it is a defined group that is involved in that, and that information is typically not disseminated back to the organizations unless it has a direct impact on operations or tactics. At the ground level, if operations and tactics are taking place to deal with this, I would suggest to you it is difficult relative to the tactic that's being put in place to not have that information be out within the different organizations. Within the fire service, if we're making a strategic or tactic operation in terms of suggesting that we're gonna do a specific operation at a place, you try and maintain it amongst the first response group, but I'm not sure how you would actually contain it if somebody was to decide to spread that information. I think clearly it's more about from a strategic level. It's making sure that at a strategy level that it is a confined group that has it, and certainly within that group, we wouldn't expect that folks would be sharing that information.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Jackson.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. Good morning, Chief Cunliffe. Thank you very much for this important presentation, and Emergency Managers Marples and Verhaeghe. And whenever Emergency Manager Connie Verhaeghe is involved, I know good things are going to come about in our city. And her and I have a little bit of wonderful history. Okay, so I just have a few questions through you to Chief Cunliffe, or either Connie or Kirsten. So on the hazard identification risk assessment on your list here, if you all recall, back in 2001, Chair Wilson, the 9/11 occurrence in the United States became our 9/15, sadly here in Hamilton, and I remember it so well, I'll never forget it. Mayor Wade at the time was at a conference in Halifax, and I was deputy mayor, thrust into duty with the torching of the Homage Temple on 20 Road and the enormous vandalism at the mosque on Stonechurch Road in my ward. I don't see terrorism here on the risk assessment of the many lists, of the many items on the list. So I guess I'm asking Chief Cunliffe, foreign dangers have basically, in your opinion, they've dropped off the list. They're not the scared they once were 20 years ago. Or is there a different manner and method, God forbid, that we ever have to worry about it, that we would deal with that kind of emergency if it occurred? Through you, Chair Wilson, please.
So through the chair to the councillor, so it doesn't mean it's off the list. These are the top 10, councillor, and so this risk assessment is based on consequence and probability. So it doesn't mean that there isn't a probability that we could see these types of incidents again. It just means in relation to the others that you're seeing here, it's much lower.
Okay, fair enough at this time. Secondly, so the three people that have emergency powers in our community, Chair Wilson, are the medical officer of health, the mayor, and the police chief. Have I heard that correctly? They have the extraordinary, exceptional powers within their jurisdictions, at least what I've been taught over the years, police chief, MOH, and mayor, that they can, within their jurisdictions, declare state of emergencies. Through you, Chair Wilson, please.
Thank you.
So through the chair to the councillor, so the mayor has the ability to declare the municipal emergency through the province. Medical officer of health has the ability to declare a health emergency, and police chief has some specific, which I don't have that answer, but he does have the power for certain places to declare.
Okay, thank you. A couple more quick questions. The pandemic overall, Chief Cunliffe, and if the city manager wishes to weigh in. Look, I can't applaud enough. I think we roughly lost about 1,000 lives in our community. Every life very, very important and sad to lose, many amongst mostly the elderly through the last 2+ years of the worldwide plague. I felt overall unprecedented times. Our EOC of the last term of council came through exemplary, and in my humble opinion, on behalf of my constituents, would have given it an A report card. However, through you, Chair Wilson, to the chief and or city manager, any downsides that you feel now that we've come through it, lessons learned, anything that you would say in hindsight, Councillor Jackson, okay, we may have gone down this path instead, we may have done this a little differently, but given the extraordinary times, unprecedented we were dealt with, we did the best we could. Just some further thoughts. Through you, Chair Wilson, please.
Thank you.
So through the chair to the councillor, we did bring an after action report relative to what the EOC did, the actions that were taken. And in that report, we identified things that we could potentially improve upon. And out of that, we are working on that collectively through emergency management in terms of the areas that we think that we still have the ability to improve. We'll do that.
Do you want to just, Chief, for public consumption, maybe just off the top of your head, between you and Connie, maybe highlight just maybe even one or two of them for public consumption, please?
Yeah, through the chair to the councillor. We did actually an in-action review midway through. So it wasn't at the end, because at every end of every emergency, we do an after-action report. Okay. And midway through, we actually did a review to say, okay, are we on track? Where are we going? What are we doing? Are we on the right path? One of those changes that came from there was that the mayor wasn't involved in the EOC management team at that time. And that became very clear in the first year of the pandemic, that the mayor needs to be involved. And so that was huge. And we made that change through it so that now the mayor is part of that EOC management team. Another really huge, big disconnect was the disconnect with the province and what the province was saying and how it was interpreted, and then how we had to roll it out. That was tough. That was tough. The communication messages and how we were rolling that out. And that is really working on how do we work better with the province and clarifying what they're asking us to do, and then how we roll it out. You remember there was a community that was in green, a community that was in red, a community that was in yellow. And oh my goodness. And that was confusing to people. That was really confusing. And how do we streamline that? That was one of those after action and those lessons learned.
Thank you, Connie. I concur with that.
Yeah, do you remember? Yeah, I can go on.
That's fine.
But yeah, Jason's there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
Sorry.
General Manager Thorne, who was the director that came after Paul Johnson. Yes.
EOC Director, correct.
Yeah, that's right. Through the chair, Jason Thorne, General Manager of Planning and Economic Development. And yes, I was in the EOC Director role. I'm still in the EOC Director role. The other sort of theme that came out of that after action report that was, I think, unique to this particular emergency was around kind of the long-term nature of the emergency, which was very different than the kinds of emergencies that, that typically some of the planning was for around, a 2 or 3 or 1 day event kind of thing. So there were some recommendations around things like contingency planning for staffing, key leadership roles, people who were assigned for multiple months to emergency response, still kind of moving forward with the regular service delivery. So there was a theme there as well around specifically what to do in these longer term emergencies that have a longer duration.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you. And huge kudos to City Manager Smith, former Mayor Eisenberger, yourself, Jason, EOC Director Thorne, former Paul Johnson, and of course, Dr. Richardson, that primarily made up the team. Lastly, I just want to thank you for highlighting and emphasizing your care about animals during emergencies, the four-legged critters that can't speak for themselves, and all the partnerships you have in the community with animal shelters and other agencies as well. As an animal lover, I really applaud that. Thank you, Chair Wilson.
Thank you very much. Councillor Taddison, please.
Always a challenge to ask questions after Councillor Tom Jackson, who brings so much levity to the room and good insight. I guess, and he also stole some of my thunder. I was going to ask, I'll go back to, first I'll go to a scenario. If something's happening at this point and we have the plume moving towards hospitals, say it's General Hospital, then we also have a detention center down there. In a system that's already over capacity, how do we ensure that we have that extra capacity in an emergency? Is that something, and again, with what you guys just earlier discussed, is that something that goes beyond us to other communities? Are we coordinated with them? Does it come to the province? Does it come to federal and military involvement?
So through the chair to the councillor, good question. So yes, that would be some of the rationale in terms of declaring an emergency. In this case, if we had to do something with the General Hospital, and certainly knowing capacities in others, we would have to look outside of the city and into other health networks to be able to relocate folks. So we would need the involvement of the province to help us with that. Same with the detention center, just given the fact that these folks would need to be put into hold facilities that mirrored the level of detention that they were in here. So we would be looking to the province or potentially the federal government, depending on areas of jurisdiction, to assist us with that type of situation.
The chair to the councillor. I've been involved in a couple of emergencies that involved the hospital. One was when we had the flood on Locke Street. That decreased the water level at Hamilton Health Sciences, McMaster particularly. And during that, it was in 2002 that occurred. And I remember distinctly getting a call from the emergency coordinator at the hospital saying, "We don't have any water. We're in trouble here." And I remember at that time calling the chief and talking about, okay, what do we need to do here? The hospital does have an evacuation plan. And so we were able to mitigate. It never happened, but immediately there was, we were in alert. There was another event that happened, and that was the flood in the ER department at St. Joe's Hospital. I don't know if you remember it, but they had to decant and move everybody out. And they did. They went to smaller hospitals, those people, and they were able to, they had a plan, and they were able to enact it. And I'll never forget getting that call and then them telling me what they were doing, and we never had to really activate at a city level. Public health was activated and the health sector emergency group was activated. So there was a plan in place, and it has worked, and we were able to decant and mitigate. We're in touch with the hospital coordinators, the emergency planners, and the coordinators all the time. They come to our meetings. We are doing scenarios with them. Coming up, we've got a scenario planned. So we do that planning and that work with them. And it's really fun. It's really fun.
And I, through the chair, I'm recognizing that it feels like it's a lot of, it's very entertaining, and I know it's not an entertainment thing, but it's emergency preparedness and it's very serious. But I'm very energized by that. And this seems to be like a very high level presentation sharing with us. When do we get to see the plans at all? Do we get to see those individual details, such as if it was going to be like a substance abuse declaration, and going through when would we activate? Would we get to see those details at all at this level here?
Through the chair to the councillor. So our emergency plan itself is public. So that's certainly something that can be shared. It is on our city website. We don't have specific plans necessarily around substance abuse and things like that. I mean, it'd be something we can speak to public health or the hospitals about, but we have secondary plans to the emergency plan as well. So we build out an emergency social service plan, evacuation center plan, that kind of thing, and we can talk about providing that information, but the emergency plan itself is public.
But the secondary plans would we have access to them as council?
I can't see why not.
Okay, thanks. And then just my last question, and it's out of curiosity, at a time when there's an emergency, I'm imagining what it's like in the 911 center, and do you have any insight how they mitigate the onslaught of calls in that situation that are going to happen?
So through the chair to the councillor, so our 911 center is managed by the Hamilton Police Service. They have a number of folks that are in there that take those calls and then disseminate. So their role is to identify what emergency service is required when somebody calls 911, and then that call is then passed off to the appropriate service. Where I can speak, for example, for fire. So if somebody was to call in and there was an emergency where they needed the fire department, then our dispatch center would be taking those calls. I can tell you that when we have large incidents and large volumes of calls, it's chaotic. But it's controlled chaos is the term that I would use. People are calling in. There's information is coming fast and furious. Our call takers, dispatchers are trying to disseminate all the pertinent information. In fact, it's very helpful when we get multiple calls, because now we can start asking additional questions, or questions that maybe that now have come up that we need answers to. Because ideally what we're trying to do is gather as much of the information of what's happened or what's happening, so that we can relay that to the first responders that are going, so that prior to arrival, that they have the ability to start to formulate some plans and some basically a picture of what they're going to be coming into, so that even in the early stages, depending on what information we are being told, we will change our response protocols or add additional resources or do things based on what it is. So we're not waiting until we actually get boots on the ground to see what's going on. So it's very much an intense situation, but it's also a situation that we take advantage of as first responders to glean as much information as we can about what's happening.
Thank you very much. And through the chair, just one last question then. With those, so let's say the 911 people who receive the calls are at capacity. Does that mean that people are calling and getting a busy signal, or what happens to the people who can't be answered immediately?
So I can't speak specifically because I don't manage or have oversight of that. But what I would suggest to you is that there have been times where we've been told that the phone rings and rings until somebody picks it up. It's just the capacity. All the phones are being answered as quickly as they can, and there's more calls coming in than there are people to answer them.
The chair to the councillor. I remember in Plastimet, 1997, we were overloaded. community calling in, needed help, needed information. And we opened up this is when I was in public health, we opened up a room with 5 or 6 phones and people there to answer those phones and answer the questions. And we've repeated that over and over again. And we did it during pandemic, where we opened up extra hotlines and contact centers, not necessarily contact center, because we have a state-of-the-art contact center. So we did provide that so that the community can call, and we published the phone number so that people can call in and get information. They get overloaded, and it's hard to manage them, but we have done it over and over again through emergencies, is opening up those hotlines and giving that number out to the community to say that you can call here.
Thank you. No more questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, member. Councillor Wang.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Wilson. Thank you so much for this presentation. I have lots of questions, and most of them were answered by your answers to other councillors, but I have several very pointed operational kind of questions. How do we work with diverse communities at a frontline level, specifically when we have communities that may not have English as a first language? How do we support the frontline workers as they're trying to communicate with those communities?
Thank you.
So through the chair to the councillor, so we have had circumstances where we have had language issues, and we work with the other emergency services, specifically with police, and we try and get interpreters or people on site to help us deal with that.
Okay. As a follow-up question then, how are we managing the significant amount of data that is being generated through emergencies and emergency response, specific to how are we keeping that data secure, and how are we keeping, essentially, I think it's a cyber attack on our emergency services. That's what I'm kind of curious about.
So through the chair to the council, I can speak on behalf of the fire department. Our data is secured under the city, through city firewalls and city systems. And we utilize our IT resources and staff to be providing us guidance and oversight in terms of how best to maintain that secure.
Okay. And my last question through you, Chair Wilson, is I think you can kind of see where my line of questioning is coming, where I'm trying to identify, are there gaps that you have identified at EOC that should be brought forward to council that we can help with mitigating some of those gaps and essentially making our emergency response stronger?
Through the chair to the councillor, appreciate that question. I think that's one of the things that, as we work through the after action report that was presented, and we look to try and improve and change some of the methods when we identify things that we need council's help from a resource perspective or whatever perspective makes sense, that we'll bring it forward in a form of report and make council aware and ask for the appropriate recommendation.
Thank you, Chief. But so as a follow-on to that last question then, I think where I'm really trying to needle in on is there are things that we don't know and we're not going to know unless we get into these types of situations. I think I'm trying to be a little more mindful of prevention. So this is where I think there's going to be significant challenges when it comes to our transfer over to the next generation 911. There's also going to be challenges when it comes to how we secure and how we access information on particularly a centralized server like an IT, like our IT department. So I would like to encourage our EOC team to really think about it from a access to communication and access to technology challenge, because we now have these significant issues when it comes to how we are communicating with our community and how we are communicating with each other. So this is sort of my concern, Chair Wilson, is that from this very high level overview, I'm really concerned about some of these gaps within our within the EOC system currently.
Through the chair to the councillor, I just wanted to add something further on EOC documentation security. So the EOC does operate on a separate server. We consult often with IT on that IMS chart that I'd shown you. There is an IT branch that sits within our EOC and would help us regarding that. I would say too that we have done a cybersecurity exercise, as Connie mentioned, probably heard over the last couple of weeks, some issues with hospitals in Toronto and that kind of thing. Part of the reason why we have a separate EOC server. We also have failovers in the EOC with regards to technology. So if our IP phone system goes down, so the phones that we all have in our offices, we have landlines within the EOC that we maintain. So those are some of the things that if we are dealing with that type of emergency, we know we still have the ability to function, and we still have the ability to be able to get information out.
Thank you. I recognize City Manager Smith on this point. Thank you.
Thank you, through you, Chair. The one thing the new council won't be aware of, in addition to the cybersecurity exercise we did, Charles Brown, our auditor and auditor general, did do a cybersecurity audit. We brought in external experts, and that obviously was an in-camera item where we shared the results with council about the results of that audit, where we're doing well, and areas to continually improve. And there was a number of management actions as well that continue to be a priority for the city.
Thank you. And if I could, on that point, I always value Councillor Wang's insight on data. If she wanted a particular briefing on that, I'm sure she could enjoy one with you or through you. Thank you. Are those, have you exhausted? Okay, thank you, Councillor Wang. I recognize Councillor Nam.
Thank you, through you, Chair, and thank you all for the presentation and the responses to the great questions around the table. I wanted to provide an anecdotal question. So my family was lived through in British Columbia evacuations alerts due to wildfires and then also due to the entire municipality flooding. And in the process of that, as well as the Fraser Valley, it took a few weeks in. But as an ongoing emergency response to the flooding, for example, the municipality, I believe, worked with the province in accessing emergency funding to enable communication to residents. And I'm curious about what those gaps or opportunities might look like. And primarily because the learning from the BC example with the flood is because there's such diverse language groups of residents that live there, they figured out how to use WhatsApp as well as social media and other dissemination tools in first languages as a way of providing those kind of tips that we saw just yesterday around the heavy rainfall preparation, those kinds of things that were coming out of the flood and what next kind of steps residents needed to be aware of. Any thoughts around that, or is that, are you looking at other province or other emergencies and some of the best practices that are coming out of there and integrating those into perhaps some of the gaps that you're identifying in your annual work? Thank you.
So through the chair to the councillor, so one of the things we do from a public education perspective, and we've been doing it for a number of years as the fire department, is we provide information based on the top languages that we have in our community. So we're trying to disseminate information from a preparedness perspective in the languages of the folks that are in our community. And so we'll continue to do that both on the fire prevention side and also on the emergency management side. Relative to during an emergency in terms of communication, that would be one of the things that we'll be looking at through our communication strategies, through the communication team, to be able to look at who the folks that are directly impacted and our ability to communicate directly with them through their native tongue and the language that they use.
Thank you. If I could, Councillor Nan, I'd like to recognize Director Grant on this, please.
Thanks.
Through the chair to the councillor. Councillor Nan, the other thing that we have done to improve our capabilities is integrating translation capabilities within the website. Currently, right now, the translate button's a little lower than we'd like to see it, so that's the next stage, is to put that a little higher. But it will give us the ability through technology to immediately translate any of the information that we have into almost every language imaginable, and we can target certain linguistic speakers that way as well. In addition to working through community groups, we can make that information available in their native language, which I think is, particularly in emergency, something that we would like to do, need to do, and will be doing.
Thank you. I think the final question would be, you may have mentioned, and I apologize, I had to come in a little bit later this morning, in terms of the relationships with community-based organizations as it relates to preparation for emergency and response to emergency. I think it was the social services particularly. So similarly to that, does the EOC also have kind of hubs of cultural groups or language-based groups that is a group of resourced people that you can turn to help disseminate information should some of our residents not go to the city's website, even though it might be available in a translated language? Back to Councillor Wilson's point around neighborhood pod work, one of the learnings that the Ward 3 office extracted during the early phases of the pandemic was the need to work with the Filipino community, for example, very specifically, and the languages and working with residents who spoke languages to help disseminate information in high dense buildings where those residents lived, as well as Somali and a few other ethnic communities that were much more effective at communicating within their own community around the ongoing changing information. But that was work that we were like feeding into the system. And then also that the community took ownership of themselves. So is that also being integrated in terms of community groups? Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair, rather, to the councillors. So I would say at this point, as groups reach out to us, we have done that. So we have had instances where building managers, for instance, have reached out and say, you know, we have this population within our building, we'd like to get information. I do see it as an opportunity, perhaps, and hopefully it's okay to say this, that through the councillors, with the knowledge that you have in your wards, that to make those connections with those community hubs, and perhaps those are things that we can do proactively. Certainly we want to do, but it's just the capacity, our little office of two here, to know who those connections are. But people do find us and they do reach out to us, and then we try to spider off those connections, and we do go and do those sessions, but there may be perhaps an opportunity if you have more knowledge of those community hubs for us to tap in. But Connie, I don't know if you have anything further. No? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a second-time speaker in Councillor Clark, but before recognizing Councillor Clark, if I could ask Councillor Spadafora to take the chair for me so that I may ask a question.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with your, what I think I heard you say is your operating premise, that preparedness starts with the person. And I'm not at all challenging that, but I would like to put it in context, the community. As we all know, not too long ago, over the holidays, the city of Buffalo was overwhelmed with snow. And I think 39 people died, 31 of those in the city itself. The overwhelming majority of those persons were African Americans, the youngest person being a 4-month-old baby. Many of those persons who died were service workers who do not have the privilege of working from home and staying off the roads when an emergency is called. They're either coming back from their job from Walmart, or they are shift workers. Many died in their cars. I would like to have a better understanding, apologies, of how our emergency plan is informed by the social determinants of health that we will be hearing more of next week at our Board of Health meeting. We will get an overview of our population health assessment, because I think, as Councillor Nan and Councillor Alex Wilson is pointing out, and Councillor Clark, in terms of our opioids death, we don't all have the same platform upon which to respond to an emergency. And we saw that in COVID as well, that it has disproportionately affected racialized residents, poorer residents in this neighborhood, in this city. Thank you. Through the chair.
Chief? Thank you.
Through to the chair. I think that there is a real opportunity there. I mean, we have connections in through public health. We have a public health emergency planner that we meet with routinely, but I do think there are further opportunities there. I would say that through the expertise in our emergency social service groups, that when there are needs, that we reach out and try to meet those needs. But I do think that there's probably an opportunity for us to look at our plans from more of that lens. So I would welcome those learnings. Bonnie, I know Connie didn't tout herself as she was the public health emergency manager for quite some time, so she may have some comments there.
Through the chair. Yeah, the social determinants of health are something that are very important, something I remember working at when I was in public health. And I think this is a good opportunity to take a look at that and see how does our emergency plan align with that. That's certainly something we could take away.
Councillor?
Thank you. I would very much appreciate.
Sorry, just GM Burden.
My apologies.
Thank you. Angie Burden, General Manager of Healthy and Safe Communities. The divisions that the team are referencing are part of Healthy and Safe Communities. We meet regularly as a leadership team, and I would suggest that we could convert one of our upcoming meetings to a working session and really look at the individual plans and impacts for each of the divisions and then filter through that lens. I'm also mindful that some of this relates to the climate change, and we have recently met with the new director and talked about how we create those linkages as well. So happy to take that forward as a working group internally to the city.
Thank you, GM Burden. Councillor?
Thank you very much. My second question, in terms of your list of risks, in relation to climate, I thought I noted floods, but I can't recall. I was wondering if you could offer a comment on how your plans will be further informed by the changing direction being offered by the province of Ontario in relation to conservation authorities, their overview, their mandate, and whether the emergency plan believes there has to be a shift in response on behalf of the city's part in that context of the vulnerability of certain people, whether they live in Dundas because of topography and the floodplain, or otherwise. If we don't have an active conservation authority commenting on permits on those sorts of things, how will our plan be informed by this new reality of this planning regime? Thank you.
Chief?
So through the chair to the councillor. So typically, councillor, the plan is a generic plan for flooding. It's not necessarily specific to any one or particular area within our municipality. And so that would be something that we would be potentially taking a look at in conjunction with the conservation authorities in terms of if there are some areas of higher risk. I think for those of us that have been in the city for long periods of time, we know those areas. We've done work in those areas, and we've seen incidents in those areas. And so it's about us doing a little bit more background work with the stakeholder groups to look at whether or not that level of risk is in fact increasing, and if it is, are there specifics that we need to start to put into some plans.
Thank you, Chief. GM Thorne would like to comment as well.
Yes, through the chair, and I think this came up a little bit yesterday with the boards and agencies presentations. Planning staff is taking the lead in meeting with the conservation authorities to understand the impacts of those service level changes. At the moment, my understanding is the CA role with respect to natural hazards is unchanged. The change relates to natural heritage. It is very difficult to determine the difference between those two in a lot of circumstances, but I think from an emergency standpoint, the natural hazard role continues for the conservation authorities, but certainly that's something we can raise at the table when we're having those conversations with the conservation authorities as whether it has any impact in terms of emergency response.
Thank you, GM Thorne. Councillor?
Thank you. I have just one final question. Thank you, Chair. Fire Chief Cunliffe, you mentioned there's a growing concern with, or there's an increase in the number of chemicals that are incoming, and I'm wondering if you could comment on where are they coming from and why? What explains this phenomenon? And that's my question. Thank you, Chair.
So through the chair of the councillor, it's not about incoming, it's just the use of chemicals in everyday life. And it's also about how the products that we have in our house, the combustibles are now made with a lot more chemical based, synthetic based, and that is now changing from a hazard perspective. It changes the degree of hazard, whether it's in our households or even in industry. And again, it just changes the dynamic for the first responder group, because what it does, it accelerates, depending on the type of situation. It can accelerate the situation, or it can actually intensify and make it that much more challenging. So it's becoming something that we have to deal with on a regular basis. What it also, in terms of my comment previously to Councillor Clark's question, is that what it means is that if we're going to some of the larger commercial industrial buildings, just given the fact that we may not know the use until we get there or what may be stored, it's the importance of ensuring that we have the ability to glean that information from responsible parties or folks that are on scene. We also, as we are made aware of these types of facilities and buildings, we send our folks in to do inspections and to get inventory lists so that we can start to pre-plan and make sure that we have an understanding of what it is we may be going into and how we're going to need to appropriately put tactics in place to deal with that.
Chair Spatafora, I lied. I do have one further question.
Oh, you have 1 minute and 11 seconds remaining.
Thank you, sir. Good. I know. No pineapple for you. If I could just ask GM Burden through the chair to tell me again what you're going to take back in terms of the population health data and how that is going to inform this work. I just want to make sure I'm clear in understanding so that frankly, expectations are made and I'm held accountable for it, and whether a motion is necessarily to that end. Thank you, Chair.
GM Burden.
Thank you, through you, Chair, to the councillor. What I'm recommending is that we, as a next step, would have a meeting with our leadership team in Healthy and Safe Communities, which includes public health, and to workshop the plan and lens it through the services that each of our divisions are providing as a first step. We also have underway through the Office of the Climate Change a workshop whereby we're looking at impacts of climate change on vulnerable individuals. And there is also work underway there that I think would nicely link in. And so the chief and I haven't spoken about this, but I'm imagining then that there would be an update that could be provided to council of the plan to reflect those inputs.
Thank you, GM Burden. Councillor, follow-up.
Thank you, Chair. Either to Elsie McCray or to GM Burden, would you offer your counsel on whether a motion is advisable?
Through you, Chair, to the councillor, I would actually defer to Chief Cunliffe about how the mechanics of the plan come together and what he would recommend.
Chief?
So through the chair to the councillor, I think one of the things that we would be best suited is if we sit down with our folks from public health and take a look at the social determinants and get their advice in terms of how we need to integrate that into the emergency plan that we have today. And then have the ability to have the conversations about to the specific level of involvement that needs to be, the same as with climate change, as we have these groups that are now working on it to help us to ensure that we do integrate the specifics where required into the plan. That would be kind of how I would perceive we start the process. So in terms of, I'm fine either way. If we can take that away and to start that work, and we can report back in terms of our progress, if that's the wishes of this council, or if you want to give us a motion, we're happy to do that too.
Thank you, Chief. GM Byrne, you wanted to add something?
Thank you, through you, Chair. For clarity of staff and consistency of process in conferring with the city manager, we'd like to have a motion and suggest that would be a good way forward.
If I could just add through the chair, one of the benefits of the motion is it gets on the outstanding business list, and so it gets tracked. It helps us with workload management, because sometimes we have to revise dates for other outstanding business items because it's the same staff working on things, and that just allows us to kind of prioritize and move dates as needed.
Okay, thank you. City Manager, Councillor, do you have?
I don't have that motion ready at hand, Chair, but I would perhaps come back to me at the conclusion, near the conclusion of the meeting for that purpose.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I could take back the chair. Thank you for filling in so supremely well. Councillor Clark, second time speaker.
Just curious if that is the jazz hands ringtone. I have a motion if I can proceed. This is a motion that the medical officer, health or designate be directed to investigate the thresholds of opioid deaths and overdoses that would enable the declaration of a state of emergency and report back to the Board of Health, and that staff be directed to include in the report the response required to address such an emergency and the available sources of funding to enable an effective response by the City of Hamilton. The clerk has it on the screen there. I would require a seconder if I have one around the table. Councillor Nan. And if I can just speak to it real quick, Chair.
Please, yes.
I was looking at some of the stats after that meeting yesterday. I went home and started looking at some of the stats. The number of deaths in 2022 due to opioid overdoses, based on what we know, is 100 deaths in 2022. In 2021, it was 170. The number of incidents where paramedics are being called out for ODs, 827 in 2022, 914 2021, and then 2020 was 565, and it goes down from there to 450. So we've more than doubled the number of overdoses in our community. I know the paramedics it takes a great deal of work when you're responding to that type of call. It's not always a calm environment when you're responding to that kind of call. And I think if we are going to tackle this issue with almost a mindset of all hands on deck, then this type of motion hopefully will come back with a response that provides us the opportunity to do that. We should be going to the province for funding on overdoses. If it is a state of emergency, we may be opening the doors to such funding. But this is not a minor issue. And when I was looking online and to that point, I mean, we actually have an opioid information highlight on our webpage. And it's filled with information about the number of incidents, the number of deaths. But what was striking to me is there's a section, paramedic incidents characterized by ward. So every single ward in the city of Hamilton has had ODs. People seem to think it's a downtown issue. It's not yes, there is a prevalence of them in downtown, but right across the city, we are seeing double-digit numbers of incidents on on ODs. So I think the motion itself will help us create a more holistic approach to it, rather than just dealing with it as one-offs. Every time there's a call, this is how we deal with it. I think we need to start realizing that this is a more holistic issue across the city, and we have to deal with it more widely, in my humble opinion. And I'll leave it to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. So the motion has been duly moved and seconded. Questions on the motion? Councillor Alex Wilson.
Not so much a question as hopefully a friendly amendment and a congratulation. I was actually writing an email to GM Burden as we spoke about how to put something on the Board of Health agenda about this. So with great thanks to Councillor Clark, I'm wondering if the motion just could be put up, and I'd be proposing to just add section C to request a little bit more information with respect to our shelter system. And I'm happy to provide some language, but I'm just hoping I can couch it in A and B already. Just because we've seen an extreme number of drug poisoning deaths or opioid deaths specific to our shelter system, and that's not necessarily reported on the information. So if as part of this report back, we could get some more information or have an item C with respect to that.
Elsie McCray, are you able to put up what we have, and then Councillor Wilson can guide us through the proposed amendment? Thank you.
And if Councillor Clark would prefer we sever them, that's also fine.
So could you speak to it again, kindly, colleague?
Yeah, so my understanding of this motion is we're looking at a broad swath of what's going on and what can we do, to be maybe curt and kind of like explaining it. And I just, under that, in the spirit of that, I'd appreciate a bit more understanding, given that so many opioid deaths recently have been related to shelters and maybe folks who are within shelter, if we could understand a little bit more under this idea of what an effective response looks like. If we could just pull that specifically out to understand what levers we can pull in our relationship with shelters potentially, is just a request from the Hamilton Harm Reduction Working Group that if we're already moving this motion forward, I think would be appreciated to include. And I see GM Burden would like to weigh in as well.
GM Burden.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, to the councillor, we can certainly provide some information. I would say that deaths are self-reported, and so there's different data that different organizations provide. We, within the city, through Housing Services, receive serious incident occurrence reports. And so that is the data that we have that could be brought forward, but the level of detail may not get to the councillor's question. So it would be a short portion we're happy to provide. I would also say that actions then coming from that as it relates to the shelter system are likely more appropriately addressed through emergency and community services. Although since this report is already coming forward, happy to add a short section to share what we do know.
And if it is all right, I'll propose very specific language. I think that's helpful to clerks. So that the report also include information on opioid deaths and/or if we could say drug poisoning, just a language choice, in City of Hamilton shelters or in shelters, and what mechanisms or what levers the City of Hamilton may be able to utilize, including safer use spaces. my apologies. I was not intending to do this today. And Councillor Clark, I jumped on. So again, if this is kind of taking away from what you were trying to do, happy to.
I'll look to the mover. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Clark.
Thank you. I think it is a valid motion, but I think it should be a separate motion, as it should be going to ECS rather than the Board of Health. Because the ECS has the authority and the interactions with and the contracts with our shelter systems.
Recognize GM Burden, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the councillor. I'm wondering, Councillor Wilson, if as a first step, in light of not necessarily being prepared to put the motion on the floor today, would it be a helpful first step to have a conversation with staff and understand sort of what data we have available, what we've done in the past, and then that could perhaps inform a motion to come forward at ECS?
Councillor Wilson?
Sure. I'm open to that. I specifically am interested in the use of safer use spaces and policy regarding that. So I'll put forward a motion, I think, to ECS, and I will connect with staff informing that motion. But I think that doesn't have to take too long. And if I could maybe do that today over email. Thank you so much. And thanks to Councillor Clark for this excellent motion and for your patience in this. And I'll withdraw this and I'll do this separately. Thank you.
Thank you both. The motion has been duly moved and seconded. If there's no further comments or questions on it, we'll take a vote. Take me affirmative, please. Councillor Pauls, are you present? Thank you. That amendment carries 12-0. I believe Councillor Clark has an additional item he wishes to speak to.
Thank you. So I'm just asking for clarity, and I'm not trying to disparage or judge anyone. I'm trying to understand the city's authority, in this case specific to the fire chief, to require property owners to report on the storage of hazardous materials over a specified volume to the fire department. So do we, I think I heard the chief say that when they arrive on the scene, they don't always know what's in the fire. And I think they have to go to the responsible party to try to understand what's in the building. So I'm trying to understand, is there a proactive direct reporting back to the fire department to say, by the way, at 123 Main Street, we're storing magnesium pellets? Do we have that type of system?
Chief Cunliffe.
So through the chair to the councillor, we do not at this time have that mechanism.
And do we know if a municipality in Ontario has the authority to create that type of bylaw that it would force property owners over specified volumes of hazardous materials to proactively report it to the fire department on an annual basis, so that you know exactly what's going on before they even get in the truck? They know, we're going to this site, it shows on our system this.
So through the chair to the councillor, I would have to do some research on that to determine whether or not what that is. I'd also want to be conferring with the Ministry of Environment as well. There may be some reporting mechanisms that the ministry has that we would be able to utilize.
And so to that end, I have another motion that we direct staff to report back. Does the city have the authority to require any property owner to report on the storage of hazardous materials over a specified volume to the Hamilton Fire Department? Want me to send it to you? 2 seconds.
If you're watching publicly, we're just, a motion is being drafted. It's going to be sent to Elsie McCray, who is our clerk. It will come up on the screen momentarily. Probably have some discussion on it. So we're not just sitting here twiddling our thumbs.
It's coming through without a title.
Well, Councillor Danko is twiddling his thumbs. I see that.
Can I provide other comments on another matter while the clerk is doing that? I think Councillor Jackson, his comments about terror or terrorism not being included is valid. I'm sitting here thinking a cyber attack could take out hydro, gas, communications. We watched when Rogers went down, and if that hit our system, what would happen? I think of poisoning in water systems. In Toronto, the driving down the street in a van and hitting people. So terrorism is no longer just a United States phenomenon. It is occurring in Canada. And I think our staff might want to think about how and what they need to prepare for those types of events. How would they tackle it? And I'll just leave it as an open-ended to our staff without a motion. Thank you.
Elsie McCray, are you able to put up on the screen? And Councillor Spadafora would like to second your motion. Are you able to display it? Elsie McCray. Thank you. Appreciate that. Councillor, would you like to read it aloud also for public consumption, please?
Thank you, Chair. I would that staff be directed to report back to the Emergency and Community Services Committee on whether the city has the authority to require any property owner to report on the storage of hazardous materials over a specified volume to the Hamilton Fire Department.
Thank you, Councillor. And that is seconded by Councillor Spadafora. Is there any comments or questions on the motion? Seeing none, then we'll vote on it, please. Councillor Francis has his thumb up, as do I. And that carries 12-0. Thank you, members. There's one outstanding motion that will be forthcoming. If I could ask Elsie McCray to display it on the screen for public consumption and for my colleagues and staff. It is moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Nan.
Through the chair, I did change a few of the wordings. Were you wanting them to investigate and report back, or you wanted them to implement? Because the way it was worded was that you wanted them to implement. So I think like that originally.
Geez, I should have handed over the chair to Councillor Spadafora. My apologies.
No problem. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I think a report back on the ability to do so might be more appropriate. I mean, obviously, I would like it to be integrated, but I would like to know the feasibility of and how they would do so.
Councillor.
If I could, through you, Chair, just make the proposal that staff be directed to identify an approach to integrate equity to the Emergency Operations Center to ensure residents made blah, 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 and then report back. I think it's literally our organization is evolving and is integrating an equity approach, which is moving towards integrating that as a lens by which we carry out all business and operations as a municipality and all of our services. So I think it's within our policy framework as a municipality to just say that they're going to integrate an approach, integrate equity, period. Like get rid of the second approach. My apologies that we're doing this live in front of the entire public. There we go. Integrate equity into the Emergency Operations Center. Is it operations or plans?
Planning.
Plans. Thank you, Kristen. To ensure residents made vulnerable or disproportionately impacted by social determinants of health and report back to General Issues Committee. And the reason versus investigating opportunities is we're beyond that as a municipality. I think what I heard from GM Burden is we're already integrating this into our work, and it's a matter of workshopping and getting those learnings integrated in and coming back with it. So thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. GM Burden.
Thank you, Angie Burden, General Manager of Healthy and Safe Communities. Through you, Mr. Chair, to the council members. I might also recommend that we add a component on resourcing. So should we really look to evolve this, the equity piece, and as staff are having their conversations, there may be resource recommendations that of what might be possible. If we had resources, we could go in this direction, and then this would be what would be possible with existing resources. So I'm wondering if we could amend that report back to GIC, including any resource implications.
Thank you, GM Burden. Councillor Wilson, you okay with that?
Yes, I am, Chair Spatafor.
So, clerk, we good? All right, so we'll call the vote. Sorry, clerk, can we go back? We have discussion here. Councillor Tattison would like to speak. Sorry, Councillor, go ahead.
I'm so sorry, but I can't vote on something I don't understand. And when you said social determinants of health, can you define that more for me?
Councillor Wilson?
Certainly, I will try my best. It's, I think, been established since 1974 that the health of a person is, there's a genetic component to it, but there is more so both a lifestyle and an environmental component. So things beyond our physical body, including the stability of our housing, our ability to access nutritious food, the ability to exercise, those social things around us, physical and otherwise, have a significant impact on our health outcomes. And so those are defined as social determinants of health because they are around us. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tattison?
It helps me to understand better. I just want to ensure that staff is going to give you what you require with this general definition.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wilson?
I really appreciate that thoughtful comment. I'm confident in the motion, and I believe it'll get us where we need to go and that we can have a more fulsome discussion as we receive that back. But thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further discussion? Okay, call the vote. That vote is carried 12-0.
Thank you, Chair Spetafor. I will assume the chair back. Is there any further comments or motions that might be coming from the floor at this time? Seeing none, on behalf of this committee, I would like to express my deep appreciation and thanks to the team that is before us today and for your important work. And certainly since 2020, clearly, I think we all have a greater appreciation of its importance, as does our community. So thank you for your diligence and your professionalism and your willingness to engage with us this morning. Thank you. So we need a mover and a seconder, I believe, to receive this presentation. It is moved by Councillor Wang, seconded by Councillor Kassar. Up. That carries 12-0. Elsie McCray, is an adjournment in order? It is moved by Councillor Jackson, seconded by Councillor Tattison, that we be adjourned. I'd also failed to recognize, I'd like to get in the habit of doing this, that at this committee, we are greatly assisted by clerks, Elsie McCray and Elsie Gauthier. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. 12-0. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you. We'll see you this afternoon at